It began with a thread. In June of 2015, in a quiet vintage clothing store named Second Act, a single piece of midnight blue silk hung as if holding its breath. The gown was a masterpiece of 1980s glamour, its fabric shimmering under the soft lights like a captured night sky. Ava Chen, the store's owner, was meticulously restoring a small tear in the lining when her fingers brushed against something unexpected. It wasn't a flaw in the fabric or a loose seam. It was intentional, a series of tiny raised knots forming shapes that felt like letters. They were almost imperceptible, stitched with thread the exact same shade as the silk, a secret designed to be felt, not seen, a whisper woven into the very fabric of the garment. Her heart began to race as she angled the dress under a brighter lamp, her breath catching in her throat. The letters were small, desperate, and undeniably clear. "He knows. Find the star pattern. Help me." The words were a ghost on the silk, a chilling plea from a forgotten time. This was not a label or a maker's mark. It was a message in a bottle, cast out into an ocean of time, finally washing ashore 3 decades after it was written. Ava stared at the embroidered cry for help, the elegant gown suddenly feeling heavy in her hands. No longer an artifact of fashion, but a piece of evidence from a crime scene that had long gone cold. The silence of her shop was shattered by the implications of what she had found. The dress was an original, a one-of-a-kind creation by Elara Vance. In the late 1970s and 80s, her name was synonymous with Hollywood royalty. Elara wasn't just a seamstress. She was a couturier, an artist who sculpted fabric to accentuate the larger-than-life personas of the silver screen. More than that, she was a confidant, her studio a sanctuary where the industry's biggest stars shed their public facades. She knew their measurements, their preferences, and their secrets. Her discretion was as legendary as her talent, making her an indispensable part of the Hollywood machine. To own an Elara Vance gown was to own a piece of that golden, tumultuous era. And now this particular gown suggested she knew a secret so dark it had cost her everything. Flashback to October 1985. The Los Angeles Police Department found Elara Vance's studio on Melrose Avenue Immaculate. It was a scene frozen in time, a silent tableau of a life interrupted. A half-finished sequin gown shimmered on a mannequin, its future silenced. A pair of golden scissors lay beside a bolt of crimson velvet, as if waiting for a hand that would never return. A cup of Earl Grey tea sat cold on her workbench next to a scattering of design sketches. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no note. Her car was still in its designated spot, her purse and keys on the table. It was as if Elara Vance, then 42 years old, had simply evaporated into the humid California air, leaving behind only the ghost of her creativity. The initial investigation, led by a young and ambitious detective Frank Miller, quickly hit a wall. They treated it as a missing person case, but the absence of any clues pushed it into a realm of pure speculation. Did she have a secret lover? Was she in debt? Did she simply walk away from a high-pressure life seeking anonymity? They interviewed dozens of people, assistants, clients, rival designers, and her heartbroken family. Each interview was a dead end, a series of fond memories and baffled expressions. The case file swelled with theories but remained devoid of a single piece of hard evidence. Hollywood, a town built on creating fiction, was stumped by a reality that felt more unbelievable than any script. For a few weeks, the mystery of Elara Vance's disappearance was the talk of the town, a headline story that captivated a city obsessed with its own mythology. News reports from the era show grainy footage of reporters camped outside her studio, speculating wildly. Hollywood's seamstress vanishes. One headline blared. LAPD baffled by designer's disappearance. Read another. The story was perfect for the tabloids. A beautiful, talented woman at the heart of the glamour industry, gone without a trace. It became a cautionary tale, a piece of Hollywood folklore whispered about at parties and in makeup trailers. But in a city with a notoriously short attention span, new scandals and new stars soon pushed Elara's story off the front page. The case officially went cold in 1987. Elara Vance was declared legally dead 5 years later. Her son, a young man forced to grow up in the shadow of his mother's vanishing act, tried to keep her memory alive, but the world had moved on. Her name, once whispered with reverence in the halls of power, slowly faded into a trivia question for film buffs and true crime aficionados. The official narrative solidified. She was a woman who, for reasons unknown, chose to disappear. A tragic enigma, but a closed chapter. The police files were boxed up and sent to a dusty archive, another unsolved case in a city full of them. The mystery of what happened to Alara Vance was sealed away, but the midnight blue dress survived. It was a silent witness, passed from an actress's estate to a collector, then to an auction house, and finally to the curated racks of Second Act. For 30 years, it held its secret close, its dark blue silk preserving a final, desperate message from its creator. While the world accepted the story of a woman who left, the dress knew the truth of a woman who was silenced. It wasn't just a relic of a bygone era of fashion. It was a vessel, a tangible link to Alara's last moments, patiently waiting for someone to look closer, to feel the subtle disturbance in the lining, and to finally hear its silent scream for justice. It was more than a dress. It was Alara's final design. The discovery of the embroidered message in 2015 was a seismic shock, a voice from the grave that shattered 3 decades of silence and official conclusions. The words, "help me," were a direct contradiction to the narrative that Alara had left willingly. They reframed her disappearance not as a mystery, but as a meticulously concealed crime. The plea transformed her from a passive victim of circumstance into a woman who fought back in the only way she could, using the tools of her trade, a needle and thread, to leave a final clue. The focus of the cold case shifted in that instant. The question was no longer Trent's something had happened to Alara Vance, but who was the he she was so afraid of? The soundproofed walls of Chloe Vance's podcast studio were her sanctuary, a controlled space where the chaos of the world was distilled into neat, compelling narratives. On a Tuesday afternoon in 2024, she was in her element, her voice a smooth, confident cadence flowing into the high-end microphone. She was wrapping up a season on a forgotten bank heist from the 90s, her words painting a vivid picture for her thousands of listeners. The room was dark, save for the glow of 2 monitors displaying audio waveforms and research notes. This was her domain, a place of facts, timelines, and the careful dissection of cold cases. Here she was in complete control, the master of stories that belonged to other people, to other families. The past was a puzzle she solved from a safe, professional distance. An unfamiliar number flashed across her phone screen, an unwelcome intrusion into her meticulously crafted workflow. She sighed, pausing the recording with a practiced click. It was probably another PR pitch or a tip on a case she had already dismissed. She almost let it go to voicemail, but a flicker of journalistic instinct made her answer. "This is Chloe," she said, her tone polite but brisk. The voice on the other end was a woman's, hesitant yet strangely resolute. "My name is Ava Chen. I own a vintage store. I think I found something that belongs to your family. It's about your grandmother, Alara Vance." The world, which had been moving at a steady, predictable pace, came to a dead stop. The name hit Chloe like a physical blow, sucking the air from the room. Alara Vance. It wasn't just a name from a dusty, unsolved LAPD file. It was the central myth of her family, the ghost at every holiday dinner, the silent question in her father's eyes. Her carefully constructed, professional demeanor crumbled in an instant. Her hand tightened on her phone, her knuckles turning white. She leaned forward, her other hand pressed against the cool surface of her desk, as if to steady herself. In the sterile quiet of her studio, that name echoed with the weight of 39 years of silence, grief, and unanswered questions. It was the one cold case she had always been too afraid to touch, the one story that was intimately, painfully hers. Ava Chen's voice continued, pulling Chloe from her daze. She explained finding the midnight blue gown, the unexpected texture in the lining, and the secret it held. Then, she read the words aloud, her voice trembling slightly over the phone. "He knows. Find the star pattern. Help me." Each word was a tiny, precise dagger, dismantling the entire narrative the Vance family had been told for decades. Help me. It wasn't the plea of a woman who chose to walk away from her life. It was the desperate cry of someone who was being dragged away from it. Chloe felt a cold dread mix with a white-hot surge of purpose. This single sentence reframed everything. Her grandmother hadn't vanished. She was taken. For her entire life, Chloe had been haunted by the ambiguity of Ilara's disappearance. The official story was a tapestry of maybes. Maybe she ran off with a lover. Maybe she buckled under the pressure. Maybe she simply wanted a new life. The lack of evidence left a void that the family filled with their own quiet, sorrowful theories. But this message, stitched into silk with a desperate hand, was evidence. It was a voice from the grave, a direct contradiction to the passive, tragic tale of a woman who disappeared. It spoke of a specific threat, a quote, and a deliberate act of concealment. The mystery was no longer a fog of possibilities. It was a crime scene with a victim, a perpetrator, and a final, cryptic clue. The irony was staggering. Chloe had built her career by giving voice to the voiceless, by digging into forgotten stories and demanding answers on behalf of strangers. She had always kept a professional wall between herself and her subjects, a necessary barrier to maintain objectivity. Now, the most important case of her life had not been found in a police archive or through a confidential source, but through a piece of vintage clothing, a message in a silk bottle. Her entire professional life suddenly felt like a training ground for this exact moment. The promise was no longer just to her listeners, to deliver a compelling story. It was a silent, solemn vow to the grandmother she never knew. "I will find you. I will find him." "Say it again," Chloe whispered into the phone, her voice hoarse. "The last part." Ava's voice came back, steady and clear. "Find the star pattern." The phrase hung in the air, an enigma wrapped in a plea. A star pattern. What could it possibly mean? A fabric design? A piece of jewelry? A coded map? It was so specific, so strange. It was the kind of detail a brilliant, creative mind would leave behind. Ilara Vance, the couturier to the stars, had used the very symbols of her trade, a needle, thread, and a hidden message, to fight back. It was her final design, a puzzle meant for someone to solve. Chloe felt a profound connection to her grandmother's ingenuity, a spark of defiant brilliance reaching across 4 decades. The weight of the discovery began to settle in her chest, heavy and profound. This was more than just a career-defining story. This was her blood, her history. She thought of her father, a man who had spent his entire adult life navigating the complex grief of losing a mother without a grave to visit. He rarely spoke of Ilara, but her absence was a palpable thing in their family. How would this revelation affect him? Would the confirmation of his mother's violent end bring him a twisted sense of closure? Or would it rip open a wound that had never truly healed? Chloe knew that in pursuing this truth, she wasn't just chasing a headline. She was tampering with the fragile peace of her own family. Her journalistic instincts, now sharpened by a deeply personal fire, took over. "Ms. Chen," Chloe said, her voice regaining its authority. "Ava, do not talk to anyone else about this. Not the police, not the media, nobody. The dress is evidence. Can you keep it safe?" She was no longer just a podcaster receiving a tip. She was now the guardian of her grandmother's final words, the first link in a chain of evidence that had been broken for nearly 40 years. The line between her personal life and her professional one had just been irrevocably erased. The implicit promise to her audience was now cemented. This season wouldn't just be about a cold case. It would be a relentless personal quest for justice. After ending the call with Ava, Chloe didn't move. She sat in the enveloping silence of her studio, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows on the wall. The world she knew just an hour ago felt like a distant country. The midnight blue gown became a vivid image in her mind, no longer a beautiful artifact of 80s glamour, but a sacred text, a silent witness holding the truth of Alara's final moments. It was a tangible link to a woman she had only known through faded photographs and her father's sad, fragmented memories. The dress wasn't just the key to solving a mystery, it was the key to understanding who she was and where she came from. She swiveled in her chair, her gaze falling upon the intricate timeline of the bank heist still on her screen. It seemed trivial now, a story of money and greed. This new story was about life, death, and a silence that had lasted far too long. All the skills she had honed, the persistent research, the careful interviews, the narrative construction, were about to be tested in the most profound way imaginable. This wasn't just another season of her podcast. This was her legacy, her duty. The ghost of Alara Vance had waited 39 years to be heard. Chloe knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would be the one to finally give her a voice. The investigation had begun. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. But this was just the beginning of a dark and twisted path into the heart of old Hollywood. The first thread had been pulled, and the entire tapestry of lies was about to unravel. Before we go any further, I need you to be a part of this journey with me. If you're as captivated by this mystery as I am, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single clue. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and I have to ask you, what would you do if you found a message like this from a family member who vanished decades ago? Do you think you could bear the weight of that truth? To understand the earthquake that was the discovered message, one must first understand the world Alara Vance had built. Her studio on Melrose Avenue in the early 1980s wasn't just a workshop. It was a confessional, a sanctuary draped in silk and secrets. The air hummed with a unique energy, a blend of intense creativity and hushed discretion. Bolts of vibrant fabric stood like sentinels against the walls. Sketches of future red carpet triumphs were pinned to corkboards, and the faint, comforting scent of Earl Grey tea always mingled with the crisp smell of new textiles. Here, amidst the gentle whir of a sewing machine and the precise snip of golden scissors, the larger-than-life personas of Hollywood came to shed their armor. Alara Vance didn't just dress them, she saw them, making her both an invaluable artist and a dangerous liability. Her client list was a veritable who's who of the era's royalty. She crafted the shimmering sheaths for screen sirens, known for their fiery tempers, and the impeccably tailored suits for leading men who cultivated images of stoic heroism. Young starlets, nervous and bright-eyed, sought her out to create the one dress that would announce their arrival. Alara's gift was an almost supernatural ability to understand the person beneath the persona, and to design garments that were not merely clothes, but extensions of their desired narrative. In the fitting room, with pins in her mouth and a measuring tape draped around her neck, she heard it all. The whispers of illicit affairs, the anxieties over a fading career, the bitter rivalries hidden behind air-kissed greetings. She was the keeper of Hollywood's most fragile truths. Among her most powerful and loyal clients was Julian Croft, a film producer whose name was synonymous with blockbuster success and immense influence. In his prime, Croft was a force of nature, impossibly charismatic, with a brilliant mind for storytelling and an even sharper instinct for the business of making stars. He was a frequent visitor to Alara's studio, often arriving unannounced with a bottle of expensive champagne to celebrate a new deal or to discuss a custom gown for his latest protege. Their relationship was one of apparent mutual admiration, a symbiotic partnership between two masters of their craft. He was the architect of Hollywood dreams, and she was the one who wove their shimmering fabric, a dynamic that placed her at the very center of his powerful orbit. The Hollywood of the 1980s was a dazzling and predatory landscape, a kingdom built on illusion. It was an era of unrestrained excess, where fortunes were made and lost on a single film, and where public image was a meticulously constructed fortress. Behind the velvet ropes and the blinding flashbulbs of premieres, a different reality existed, one governed by handshake deals, unspoken threats, and a rigid code of silence. Secrets were the most valuable currency, hoarded and traded to maintain power. A scandal, if not expertly contained, could topple an empire. In this glittering, high-stakes world, a person like Ilara Vance, who knew where all the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking, was both a cherished asset and a potential ticking time bomb. Her disappearance was a tremor that threatened to crack the entire facade. Beyond the glamour and the high-powered clientele, Ilara Vance was a mother. Her son, Liam, was the quiet center of her universe. Despite the long hours and the demanding personalities she catered to, she carved out a protected space for him, a world far removed from the pressures of her profession. She would come home, the scent of celebrity perfume still clinging to her clothes, and transform back into just Mom. She taught him how to see the world with an artist's eye, pointing out the way light hit a building or the intricate patterns in a leaf. These moments of quiet normalcy were the foundation of Liam's world, making her sudden absence not just a public mystery but a deeply personal and incomprehensible wound that would shape the entire course of his life, and eventually, his daughter Chloe's. On that fateful day in October 1985, the world was proceeding as it always had. Ilara was in the final stages of designing a breathtaking, sequined gown for an A-list actress set to attend the Academy Awards. The studio was a hive of focused activity. She had spoken to Liam on the phone that afternoon, her voice warm and reassuring, promising to be home in time to read him a bedtime story. There was no hint of fear, no trace of distress. The half-finished gown stood on its mannequin, shimmering under the studio lights, a promise of future glory. The scene was one of absolute, professional normality, a snapshot of a life in full, creative flight. This placid before makes the after all the more chilling. The silent, undisturbed studio, a testament to how swiftly and completely a life can be erased. The case file landed on the desk of a young, sharp, and ambitious LAPD detective named Frank Miller. The Vance disappearance was his first high-profile case, a chance to prove his mettle. From the moment he first stepped into the Melrose studio, he knew something was profoundly wrong. It wasn't a crime scene. It was a tableau, a perfectly preserved moment in time. There was no forced entry, no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture. Her purse, containing her wallet and keys, sat on a workbench next to a cold cup of tea. It was as if the laws of physics had been momentarily suspended, allowing a person to simply dematerialize. Miller's instincts screamed that this tidiness was a lie, that the absence of chaos was more disturbing than its presence, a meticulously clean slate. Miller's initial investigation immediately collided with a wall of polite, impenetrable silence. He conducted dozens of interviews, moving through the gilded circles of Hollywood's elite. He spoke with assistants, rival designers, and a gallery of famous faces, all of whom expressed shock and profound sadness. When he interviewed Julian Croft, the producer was the picture of urbane grief, praising Ilara's talent and offering his full cooperation while providing no useful information. It was the same story everywhere. Everyone was devastated, but no one saw anything, heard anything, or knew anything. Miller quickly realized he wasn't just investigating a missing person. He was confronting an institution. Hollywood was protecting one of its own, and the truth about Ilara Vance was being deliberately and skillfully buried under a mountain of influence. Detective Frank Miller's frustration festered, growing more corrosive with each polite but empty interview. He was a cop who believed in facts, in evidence you could hold and photograph, but this case was built on smoke and mirrors, on the carefully polished alibis of Hollywood's most powerful people. He felt an invisible wall every time he got close to a real line of questioning, particularly concerning Julian Croft. The producer's influence seemed to radiate through the department, with subtle hints from Miller's superiors to tread lightly, to avoid ruffling the feathers of the city's golden geese. Miller knew in his gut that Ilara Vance hadn't just walked away. She had been erased, and the people who knew why were part of a silent conspiracy, protected by wealth and a code of silence he couldn't crack. This case became his ghost, a failure that would follow him long after he turned in his badge. Julian Croft, meanwhile, played the part of the bereaved friend with masterful precision. He appeared on television, his face a mask of dignified sorrow, speaking eloquently about Alara's unique genius and their close, collaborative friendship. He announced a $100,000 reward for any information leading to her safe return, a gesture that was lauded by the press as a testament to his loyalty and generosity. Behind the scenes, however, he was a different man. His lawyers were notoriously aggressive, and any journalist who dug too deep into his connection with Alara received thinly veiled threats of litigation. He was building a fortress of sympathy and legal intimidation around himself, ensuring that his name was associated with grief, not suspicion. Croft was a storyteller, and he was crafting the most important narrative of his life, his own innocence in the face of a tragedy he had orchestrated. As the weeks turned into months, the story of Alara Vance inevitably began to fade from the front pages. Los Angeles in the 1980s was a city with a voracious appetite for scandal and a notoriously short attention span. Without a body, a suspect, or a dramatic breakthrough, the mystery of the vanished seamstress lost its novelty. It was replaced by stories of blockbuster film premieres, rock star overdoses, and political intrigue. The reporters camped outside her Melrose studio, packed up their cameras, and moved on to the next big story. The public discussion of Alara Vance slowly transitioned from a pressing news item to a piece of Hollywood folklore, a cautionary tale whispered at industry parties. The city's collective memory moved on, allowing the truth of her disappearance to be buried under layers of new distractions, just as the perpetrators had hoped. For Liam Vance, Alara's teenage son, the world had fractured into a before and an after. Before, his life was anchored by his mother's vibrant presence, her creativity, and her unwavering love. After, he was adrift in a sea of confusing news reports, intrusive questions, and the hollow ache of her absence. He was forced to grow up overnight, watching as the police investigations stalled and the world's interest waned. He was left with a ghost, a collection of beautiful memories, now tainted by the terrifying mystery of her end. This profound, unresolved loss became the defining trauma of his life, a quiet wound he would carry into adulthood. It shaped his relationships, his worldview, and instilled in him a deep-seated distrust of the glittering world that had stolen his mother and then casually forgotten her, a pain he would one day pass down to his daughter, Chloe. In the absence of any concrete evidence of foul play, the official narrative began to solidify around a more palatable, less disturbing conclusion. The LAPD, facing mounting pressure to close an unsolvable case, leaned into the theory that Alara had simply chosen to disappear. It was an explanation that required no perpetrator and no motive beyond the vague notion of personal crisis. Perhaps the pressure of her high-stakes career became too much. Perhaps she had a secret lover and ran away to start a new life. This version of the story was easier for the public to accept and, more importantly, it was a narrative that Hollywood's elite could comfortably live with. It transformed Alara from a potential victim of a violent crime into the author of her own mysterious fate, effectively closing the book on any further, more uncomfortable inquiries. The midnight blue gown, the silent witness to Alara's final hours, began its own quiet journey. Originally commissioned for a famous actress who was a client of both Alara and Julian Croft, the dress was delivered to her shortly after the disappearance. It was worn once to a premiere, its dark silk shimmering under the flashbulbs, its terrible secret held close. Years later, following the actress's death, her extensive wardrobe was sold at a high-profile estate auction. The gown was purchased by a wealthy private collector in Europe, a woman with a passion for classic Hollywood couture. For decades, it remained in a climate-controlled archive, a piece of fashion history. Its journey from a star's closet to a collector's vault ensured its preservation, keeping the delicate, embroidered piece safe until it could finally find its way into the hands of someone who would look close enough to see it. Among the items catalogued from the pristine studio was Alara's most iconic tool, a pair of custom-made, gold-plated fabric shears. They were a gift from a legendary director, a token of his appreciation for her work on his film, and she was rarely seen without them. Detective Miller found them lying on her workbench, resting beside a bolt of crimson velvet, as if she had just set them down to answer the phone. They were spotless, without a single fingerprint smudging their gleaming surface beyond what was expected. To Miller, this was one of the most unsettling details of the scene. A craftsman, an artist like Ilara, would never abandon her most prized instrument in the middle of a creative act. The pristine, abandoned scissors became a symbol for him of a life interrupted with surgical precision, a creative force silenced in an instant by an intruder who left no other trace. While the official story settled into one of a voluntary disappearance, a quiet, unspoken fear rippled through Ilara's inner circle. Other designers, assistants, and even some of her more perceptive clients understood the subtext. Ilara Vance knew too much. Her vanishing act served as a chilling, implicit warning. In a town where careers were built on carefully managed images and secrets were a form of currency, her fate demonstrated the ultimate price of being a confidant. It reinforced the cardinal rule of Hollywood: discretion is paramount and silence is survival. This undercurrent of fear helped to ensure that no one would ever step forward. The message was clear and brutally effective. If a woman as respected and connected as Ilara Vance could be erased so completely, then nobody was safe. The first concrete step was to take possession of the past. Chloe met Ava Chen at the Second Act Vintage store the next day, the bell above the door chiming softly, a sound too cheerful for the gravity of the moment. Ava had the midnight blue gown carefully laid out on a table, draped in protective, acid-free paper. Seeing it in person was a jolt. The silk was even more vibrant than in photos, a deep, living color that seemed to drink the light in the room. Chloe reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers brushing against the fabric. It was cool to the touch, impossibly smooth, yet it felt as heavy as a headstone. This was the last thing her grandmother had created. It was the garment that held her final, desperate words. In that moment, the 39-year-old mystery ceased to be a family legend. It became a tangible, physical reality she could hold in her hands. Her journalistic instincts, honed over years of dissecting cold cases, took immediate control, forming a necessary shield against the wave of emotion. This dress was not a family heirloom, it was a crime scene. She carefully packaged the gown and made a call to a name she kept for her most difficult cases: Dr. Marcus Thorne, a forensic textile expert at UCLA. Thorne was a genius, a man who could read a story in a single fiber. Over the phone, Chloe was precise and professional. She needed two things. First, a definitive analysis of the embroidery thread to confirm its age and composition, proving it was contemporaneous with Ilara's disappearance in 1985. Second, and more importantly, she asked him to conduct a full microscopic analysis of the entire garment for any trace evidence: pollen, soil, hair, chemical residues, anything that could anchor the dress to a specific, unknown location. The gown had a story to tell, and Thorne was the only one who could translate it. While the dress was in the sterile, controlled environment of Dr. Thorne's lab, Chloe turned her attention to a far more volatile archive: her father's house. Liam Vance lived in a quiet suburban home, a place where the ghosts of the past were politely ignored. When Chloe asked about Ilara's old belongings, she saw a familiar flicker of pain in his eyes. He led her to the attic, a space thick with the scent of cedar and aging paper. The air was still and heavy with unspoken grief. He pointed to a stack of sealed boxes in the corner. "Everything's in there," he said, his voice strained. "Her sketches, her notes. I haven't looked at them since it happened." He was afraid of what she might find, not because it would reveal a killer, but because it would resurrect the mother he had lost so completely. For Liam, this wasn't an investigation. It was an exhumation of a carefully buried wound. Chloe spent hours in that dusty attic, carefully opening boxes that hadn't seen the light of day in nearly 4 decades. She found portfolios filled with Ilara's iconic designs, the pages filled with elegant, confident strokes of charcoal and ink. There were fabric swatches stapled to notes, invoices, and letters from famous clients. It was a time capsule of a brilliant career. Her heart ached with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Then she found it, a large leather-bound portfolio labeled EV Designs, 1984-85. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside were the final designs, including a preliminary sketch of the sequined gown that was left unfinished on the mannequin. She meticulously turned each page, her eyes scanning for any mention of a star pattern, any unusual doodle or note. But there was nothing. Just page after page of breathtaking artistry. A silent testament to a life cut short. Just as she was about to close the final sketchbook, her fingers brushed against a slight bulge in the back cover. It was a hidden pocket, cleverly integrated into the binding. Her breath caught in her throat. She carefully worked it open and pulled out a small, folded piece of drawing paper. It wasn't a dress design. It was a series of small, intricate drawings of star constellations. They were sketched with a hurried, almost frantic energy, yet they were precise. There was Orion, with its distinct belt. There was the familiar W shape of Cassiopeia, and there was the Big Dipper, Ursa Major. This was it. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. The star pattern wasn't a pattern on a fabric. It was a pattern in the sky. It was a map. A code left by a brilliant mind under unimaginable duress. She took the sketches back to her studio, her mind racing. The drawings were a puzzle, and her grandmother had trusted that one day someone would be able to solve it. She spread the fragile paper out under a bright light, her journalistic training kicking in. These weren't just constellations. They were drawn from a specific perspective, at a specific orientation. It was a star chart, a celestial map for a particular night. Pulling up astronomical software on her computer, she began the painstaking process of matching the hand-drawn patterns to the sky over Los Angeles in October of 1985. She input the date of Ilara's disappearance. The stars on her screen began to shift, aligning with the frantic doodles made by her grandmother's hand. The silence of her studio was absolute, broken only by the frantic clicking of her keyboard as she worked to decipher a 39-year-old message from the heavens. In that moment, working late into the night, Chloe felt an almost unbearable closeness to the grandmother she had never met. She could almost feel Ilara's presence in the room, a guiding hand reaching across time. This was not just the work of a seamstress. It was the work of a strategist, a woman who, facing her own end, refused to be silenced. She had used the tools of her trade, her eye for design, her precision, her intellect, to craft one final secret masterpiece. It was a puzzle box made of paper and stars. Chloe felt a profound sense of responsibility, a solemn vow to be as clever and as relentless as Ilara had been in her final moments. She wasn't just solving a case, she was honoring her grandmother's final act of defiance, proving that her intelligence could not be so easily extinguished. Her phone rang, shattering the quiet. It was Dr. Thorne. His voice was low and serious. "Chloe, I have the initial results." He started with the first confirmation. The microscopic analysis of the thread in the "Help Me" message showed it was a silk-cotton blend, consistent with high-end materials from the mid-1980s. The stitching was hasty, done with a needle not meant for such delicate work. The message was authentic. Then came the bombshell. "We found significant trace evidence embedded deep in the gown's hem," Thorne said. "It's a specific type of red clay soil, rich in vermiculite. Geologically, it's a match for a very limited area in the western Santa Monica Mountains." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "That soil composition is found nowhere near her Melrose studio. Wherever Ilara was when she died, it wasn't in the city. Someone took her somewhere remote." The phone call with Dr. Thorne ended, but the silence that followed was deafening, filled with the echo of his words, Santa Monica Mountains. Chloe stared at the wall, her mind a whirlwind of connecting threads. The star pattern. The red clay soil. It wasn't two separate clues. It was a single brilliant message delivered in two parts across time and science. The frantic sketches of constellations were not an abstract code. They were a map. And the microscopic particles of Earth, embedded in the hem of that midnight blue gown, were the destination marker. A cold, Hard certainty washed over her, chilling her to the bone. Her grandmother hadn't just been taken. She had been taken to a specific, remote place, a place Ilara had managed to identify for them in the sky before she was silenced forever. The abstract grief of a family mystery was rapidly solidifying into the terrifying geography of a real crime. With renewed urgency, Chloe turned back to the sketches spread across her desk. The hasty, energetic lines no longer looked like simple doodles. They were charged with desperation, a final, frantic act of communication. She pulled up a detailed, topographical map of the Santa Monica Mountains on her largest monitor, the digital terrain glowing in the dark studio. Placing Ilara's drawing beside it, she began the painstaking work of overlaying the celestial with the terrestrial. She rotated the star chart, aligning it with the presumed orientation of the sky on that October night in 1985. Her breath hitched as she saw it. The three bright stars of Orion's belt corresponded perfectly with a trio of peaks in the western part of the range. It was a perfect match, an ingenious piece of cartographic thinking from a woman fighting for her life. This was her grandmother's mind at work, a beacon shining from the past. The alignment was undeniable. Following the celestial guide, she traced a line from the brightest star, Sirius, through Orion's belt. On the map, this line led directly to a deep, isolated ravine. Chloe zoomed in, her heart pounding against her ribs as the name of the location materialized on the screen in stark, white letters. Croft Canyon. The name hit her with the force of a physical impact. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a confirmation. A quick search of public property records confirmed her worst fears. The land had been owned from 1982 to 1990 by a subsidiary corporation of Julian Croft's production company. The he from the dress, the orchestrator of the perfect disappearance, now had a name tied to a specific patch of earth. Ilara hadn't just pointed to a random spot, she had pointed directly at her killer's domain. Armed with this explosive information, Chloe knew she couldn't proceed alone. She drove to the quiet suburban street where retired Detective Frank Miller lived, the printed soil analysis and the annotated map feeling like live wires in her hands. She found him tending his garden, a man who seemed to have made peace with the past, but as she laid the evidence on his patio table, she saw a change in his eyes. The tired retiree faded away, and the sharp, hungry detective from 1985 resurfaced. He studied the documents, his fingers tracing the outline of Croft Canyon on the map. "We never looked here," he murmured, his voice a low growl of regret. His alibi was for the city. He had a dozen witnesses placing him at a dinner in Beverly Hills. We never thought to look for a secondary location. He kept us chasing our tails downtown while she was out here. Miller disappeared into his house and returned with a worn, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "My unofficial notes," he explained. "The things my lieutenant told me to forget." He flipped through the book, the dry paper whispering of long-dead leads. His finger stopped on an entry dated November 5, 1985. He read it aloud, his voice heavy. "Spoke to E.V.'s junior assistant. Terrified. Mentioned a terrible argument between Vance and Croft at the studio 2 days before she went missing. Something about a young actress, and a promise he broke. Assistant called me the next day, crying, said she was mistaken, begged me to tear up the note. Said Mr. Croft's lawyer had already called her. It was a ghost of a lead, suppressed by fear and influence, now resurrected as the first solid proof of a motive." For Chloe, hearing Miller read that entry was like watching a grainy photograph sharpen into high definition. The story was no longer just about a disappearance, it was about a confrontation. The image of her grandmother, the elegant and composed artist, was suddenly replaced by one of a brave woman standing up to a powerful, dangerous man. The words from the dress, "He knows," now carried a chilling new weight. Ilara knew something Julian Croft had done, something involving another young woman, and she had confronted him about it. Her disappearance wasn't a random act of violence. It was a deliberate, calculated act of silencing. She had been erased, not because of who she was, but because of what she knew. The investigation had just pivoted from a what happened to a why. The retired detective leaned back, the notebook still open in his hands, his expression a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. He elaborated on the airtight alibi that had so effectively shielded Julian Croft from any real scrutiny back in 1985. "It was a masterpiece of misdirection," Miller said, his voice laced with a bitter admiration. He was at the Musso and Frank Grill, surrounded by the biggest names in Hollywood. "We had 20 unimpeachable witnesses who swore he never left their site from 8 p.m. until after midnight. The timeline was solid. We couldn't touch him. But the alibi was a fortress, built to defend a specific location. It accounted for his presence in the heart of Hollywood, but it said nothing about what could have been happening simultaneously, miles away in the desolate, privately owned canyon under his control. The perfect alibi suddenly looked like the perfect lie. Chloe left Miller's house with the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She had a victim who knew a dangerous secret, a powerful suspect, a motive rooted in a forgotten argument, and now, a precise location that sidestepped his carefully constructed alibi. The path forward was terrifyingly clear. Croft Canyon was no longer just a spot on a map. It was a destination. It was the potential grave of her grandmother and the heart of a 39-year-old conspiracy. The question hanging in the air was no longer one of evidence, but of courage. To go to that canyon would be to knowingly step into the shadow of a man who had made Alara Vance disappear. It was a direct challenge, a journey into the dark history of a place where Hollywood's most terrible secrets were buried. The first episode of Chloe's podcast, The Star Pattern, landed like a carefully thrown stone, its ripples spreading faster than she could have imagined. She methodically laid out the story, starting with the midnight blue dress and its desperate, embroidered plea. She detailed the discovery of the star chart in Alara's sketchbook and the chilling forensic link provided by Dr. Thorne, the red clay soil that pointed directly to a canyon once owned by Julian Croft. At the end of the episode, she took a deep breath and did the one thing Detective Miller never could. She named Julian Croft as a person of interest in the 39-year-old disappearance of her grandmother. It was a declaration of war, broadcast to thousands of listeners, a direct challenge to a man who had built an empire on buried secrets and the power of silence. The blowback was immediate and immense, but it didn't come from Croft himself. Instead, the old Hollywood machine, dormant for years, roared to life to protect one of its own. Op-eds appeared in trade magazines, penned by veteran journalists, questioning Chloe's motives and painting her as a ghoulish opportunist exploiting a family tragedy for podcast fame. Old acquaintances of Alara, people who hadn't spoken her name in decades, suddenly gave interviews reaffirming the official narrative of a woman who simply buckled under pressure and walked away. It was a masterful, coordinated campaign of character assassination, a clear message sent without a single direct threat. The walls of silence that Miller had faced in 1985 were being rebuilt around her, brick by insidious brick, demonstrating that Croft's influence was as potent as ever. The intimidation then became more personal, shifting from the public sphere to the shadows of her own life. A sleek black sedan, the kind favored by private security firms, began parking across the street from her apartment building, staying for hours at a time, before silently pulling away. There was a new, faint static on her phone line during calls with Miller. Her laptop, which held all her research, was hacked, the attempt clumsy but unmistakable. These weren't overt threats. They were calculated acts of psychological warfare, designed to make her feel isolated and constantly watched. It was a classic tactic of the powerful, to erode an opponent's sanity, to make them question every shadow and every sound until their own paranoia became the weapon that defeated them. The message was clear. We see you, we can get to you. One rainy Tuesday, the threat arrived on her doorstep. It was a small, brown, padded envelope, damp from the downpour, with no postage and no return address. It hadn't come through the mail. Someone had placed it there. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she picked it up. It was light, almost weightless. Back inside her apartment, with the door double-bolted, she carefully tore it open. There was no note, no letter, no explanation. Nestled in the bubble-wrap lining was a single, unlabeled microcassette tape, an obsolete piece of technology that felt like a relic from another era. She stared at it, a cold dread creeping up her spine. This wasn't a clue sent by an ally. It felt like a taunt, a piece of the past delivered by a ghost, daring her to listen. Chloe's hands trembled as she hunted down an old microcassette player from a dusty corner of a local pawn shop. The entire process felt surreal, a ritual from a bygone era. Back in the sterile quiet of her studio, she slid the tiny tape into the machine. The mechanical click as the door shut was unnervingly loud, a final seal before the past could speak. For a long moment she just stared at the play button, her mind racing through terrifying possibilities. Was it a trap? A recording of threats? Or worse, something designed to mislead her, to send her chasing a ghost down a dead-end path? Gathering her courage, she pressed the button. The spools began to turn, and after a hiss of static, a sound emerged from the small speaker. A muffled, distorted argument, a violent echo from 1985. The audio quality was terrible, warped by time and the cheap recording device, but the voices were unmistakable. One was her grandmother's, Alara's tone not soft and creative, but sharp, furious, and laced with a fear Chloe had never imagined. The other voice was deeper, smoother, a low and menacing rumble that she recognized from old interviews. Julian Croft. They were fighting, their words overlapping in a torrent of anger. Through the static, certain phrases sliced through like shards of glass. "What you did to her, Julian, in that dark room," Ilara's voice cried out. Croft's reply was a venomous hiss. "You know nothing. You will say nothing." And then, the words that stopped Chloe's heart, "Isabella's death was not an accident, and you will not ruin me over it." The name hung in the air, a key to a lock Chloe didn't even know existed. Isabella. With a frantic energy, she and Miller dove back into the archives, their search now laser-focused on Julian Croft's productions from the mid-'80s. They found her within an hour. Isabella Monet, a vibrant 22-year-old starlet on the verge of a major breakthrough. She had been the lead in Croft's 1985 blockbuster, Neon Sunset. Her official cause of death, 3 weeks before Ilara vanished, was listed as an accidental overdose of barbiturates in her on-set trailer. The case was closed in less than 48 hours. The final chilling detail was in the production notes. The elaborate gown Isabella was wearing in her final scene was a custom creation, an original design by Ilara Vance. The entire 39-year-old mystery snapped into horrifying focus. It wasn't about an affair or a broken business promise. It was about murder. Ilara, a trusted confidant, had likely been one of the last people to speak to Isabella Monet. She must have learned or suspected the truth, that the young actress's overdose was staged. The argument on the tape was Ilara confronting a killer, a woman armed with a terrible truth against a man armed with absolute power. Her disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was the second act of a crime. She had been silenced to preserve the secret of Isabella's death. The case had just doubled in scope, escalating from a single vanishing act to a potential serial crime cover-up orchestrated by one of Hollywood's most revered figures. The puzzle pieces were now falling into place with terrifying speed, revealing a picture far darker than Chloe had ever imagined. Detective Miller, reinvigorated with a righteous fury, used his few remaining connections inside the LAPD to discreetly pull the original coroner's report for Isabella Monet. The document was brief and conclusive, signed by a Dr. Alistair Finch. But Miller's contact found something else. A financial record showing that Dr. Finch, a career civil servant with a modest salary, had received a deposit of $250,000 into an offshore account just 1 month after signing off on Isabella's death certificate. 2 weeks after that, he took an early retirement and moved permanently to the Cayman Islands. The conspiracy was real. It wasn't just Croft. It was a network of corruption, a system built to protect him. Chloe felt a profound shift in the very ground beneath her feet. This was no longer a quest for family justice, chronicled on a podcast. She had inadvertently kicked open the door to a crypt, disturbing a conspiracy of silence and complicity that had held for nearly 4 decades. The black sedan parked on her street was no longer a vague intimidation tactic. It was a direct warning from a man who had killed at least twice to protect his secrets and had the resources to corrupt law enforcement and medical examiners. The stakes had escalated from uncovering the truth to surviving it. Julian Croft was not just a relic of old Hollywood. He was a predator who was still very much alive, and now he knew she was coming for him. The weight of this new reality was crushing. Chloe looked at the evidence spread across her desk. The dress, the star map, the soil analysis, the microcassette, and saw it not as a collection of clues, but as a testament to 2 women her grandmother had tried to save. Ilara Vance's final desperate act wasn't just a cry for help for herself. It was an attempt to get justice for Isabella Monet. She had failed and paid the ultimate price. Now the responsibility rested on Chloe's shoulders. To publish the contents of that tape would be to light a fire that could consume everything, including herself. But to stay silent would be to let Julian Croft win, to let the ghosts of Ilara and Isabella remain unheard forever. The investigation had reached a point of no return. The weight of the recording settled in the studio's silence, a suffocating blanket of static and malice. Chloe and Frank Miller sat for a long moment, the muffled, angry voices from the microcassette still echoing in the space between them. It was no longer a theory. It was a fact, captured on magnetic tape. Ilara Vance had confronted Julian Croft about the death of Isabella Monet, and he had silenced her for it. The scope of their investigation had just violently doubled. This was not about 1 murder, but 2, and the 39-year-old conspiracy that connected them. Miller, his face grim, finally broke the silence. "He didn't just make her disappear," he said, his voice a low growl. "He was tying up a loose end. We can't go to the police with just this tape. They'll bury it, just like they buried my original investigation. We need more. We need to dismantle his whole world." Miller, energized by a righteous fury that had been dormant for decades, decided to pull on the most tangible thread, the corrupt medical examiner, Dr. Alistair Finch. He knew that a direct inquiry through official channels would trigger alarms all the way back to Croft. Instead, he reached into his past, making a clandestine call to an old friend, a retired financial crimes investigator, now living a quiet life in the Cayman Islands. He framed his request carefully, not as a police matter, but as a personal one, a favor for a friend. He didn't ask for bank records or legal documents. He just asked for whispers, for local color. He wanted to know how a career public servant had afforded a life of tropical luxury. He was hunting for the ghost of that $250,000 payoff, seeking to prove that the first brick in Croft's wall of silence was built on a foundation of greed. While Miller chased the money trail across the Caribbean, Chloe immersed herself in the life and death of Isabella Monet. The young actress had been reduced to a tragic footnote, a cautionary tale of Hollywood excess. Chloe wanted to restore her humanity, to understand the woman Ilara had died trying to protect. She spent days poring over digital archives of old industry magazines, production call sheets from Neon Sunset, and grainy paparazzi photos. She was searching for a name, a friend, a confidant, anyone who was in Isabella's inner circle during those final terrifying weeks. She needed someone who saw past the manufactured narrative of an accidental overdose. Someone who might have noticed Croft's predatory control or Isabella's growing fear. She was looking for another voice, one that Croft's machine hadn't managed to completely silence. After cross-referencing call sheets with tabloid photos, she found a promising lead. A woman named Sarah Jenkins was listed as Isabella Monet's personal makeup artist throughout the filming of Neon Sunset. A deeper search revealed that Jenkins had left the film industry entirely just weeks after Isabella's death, moving to Oregon to open a small flower shop. It was a classic sign of someone running from a trauma. Chloe felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with caution. Sarah Jenkins would have been intimately close to Isabella, a keeper of the secrets shared in the vulnerability of the makeup chair. She would have been there in the final days. Making contact was a tremendous risk. If Sarah had been paid or threatened into silence, a call from a journalist investigating a 39-year-old crime could send her running right back to the people who had silenced her in the first place. With her heart pounding, Chloe dialed the number for the Oregon flower shop. When a woman with a soft, cautious voice answered, Chloe introduced herself not as a podcaster, but as Alara Vance's granddaughter. The name hung in the air for a moment. When she then mentioned Isabella Monet, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy and freighted with fear. Sarah's voice, when it returned, was a choked whisper. "I can't talk about this." She was about to hang up, but Chloe pivoted. She didn't press about Croft or murder. Instead, she spoke of her grandmother, of the dress, of the desperate plea for help. "I think my grandmother was trying to get justice for Isabella," Chloe said softly. "I think she died for it." This plea to shared humanity broke through the wall of fear. "Don't call me again," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Come to the shop, tomorrow, alone." The following morning, a secure, encrypted message appeared on Miller's phone. It was his friend from the Caymans. The information was explosive. Dr. Alistair Finch had arrived on the island in early 1986, not as a humble retiree, but as a man of immense and sudden wealth. He bought a waterfront estate and a yacht, paying in cash. He was a fixture at the island's most exclusive casinos, known for his reckless betting and heavy drinking. He often boasted drunkenly about a golden parachute he'd received from a Hollywood devil. Then came the most chilling detail. Finch had died 2 years prior in a supposed boating accident. His boat had exploded. The local investigation was cursory, and the cause was ruled an engine malfunction. It was clear now. Croft's network wasn't just about payoffs. It was lethally efficient at cleaning up its own loose ends, even decades later. Chloe's flight to Portland was fraught with a new, heightened sense of dread. The confirmation of Finch's murder meant that Croft's reach was long and his methods were final. She met Sarah Jenkins in the quiet, fragrant back room of her flower shop, a place that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the brutal glamour of a 1980s film set. Sarah, now a woman with kind eyes etched with a lifetime of worry, told her story in a hushed, trembling voice. She described Julian Croft's obsession with Isabella. He was not a mentor, he was a captor. He controlled her diet, her friendships, her every move. Sarah confirmed she had often used heavy concealer to cover bruises on Isabella's arms and neck, which the actress had dismissed as on-set accidents. It was the first living testimony that confirmed the abusive, violent nature of Croft's control. Then, Sarah provided the connection that solidified the entire timeline. She vividly remembered the day Isabella returned from a fitting with Alara Vance, just 2 days before she died. Isabella was shaken, but also filled with a new, defiant resolve. "She told me, Alara is going to help me. She knows people. She's going to get me away from him," Sarah recounted, her eyes filling with tears. More damningly, Sarah was on set the night Isabella died. She saw Julian Croft leaving Isabella's private trailer less than an hour before the overdose was discovered. She saw the rage in his face. The next morning, before she could speak to anyone, she was visited by one of Croft's lawyers, who handed her a cashier's check for $50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement that promised swift and ruinous litigation if she ever spoke of it. The story Sarah told was not just a corroboration of the tape, it was a powerful, first-hand account of the conspiracy in action. It proved that Croft had motive, means, and opportunity for Isabella's murder. It also showed the meticulous efficiency of his cover-up machine. The payoffs and threats were not an afterthought. They were deployed immediately, a preemptive strike against the truth. Chloe now had more than just circumstantial evidence and a distorted recording. She had a credible, sympathetic eyewitness who could place Croft at the scene of the crime and testify to the system of intimidation he used to ensure silence. The narrative of her podcast had just transformed from a speculative investigation into a story with a living, breathing witness at its heart. The legal and moral weight of her case had grown tenfold. On the flight back to Los Angeles, Chloe felt the pieces of the conspiracy lock into place, forming a terrifyingly complete picture. This was never just about one man. It was about a network, an ecosystem of corruption that included powerful lawyers, complicit security teams, and a medical examiner who sold his integrity for a life of luxury and a violent death. Ilara Vance hadn't just discovered a secret. She had uncovered a criminal enterprise, a well-oiled machine built for the express purpose of enabling a predator and erasing his victims. The scope of the evil was staggering. It had persisted for nearly 40 years, protected by wealth, influence, and the mortal fear it had instilled in anyone who got close to the truth. Chloe realized she was no longer just an investigative journalist. She was a threat to that entire system. Returning to her studio, she and Miller laid out the new evidence on her large whiteboard. It was a web of names, dates, and transactions, with Julian Croft at its center. They had Sarah Jenkins' eyewitness testimony, the financial evidence of Dr. Finch's bribe, and the deeply suspicious circumstances of his death. The investigation had spiraled far beyond the disappearance of Ilara Vance. It was now a multi-decade saga of abuse, murder, and institutional corruption. The stakes had been raised to an almost unbearable level. To move forward now was to declare war not just on a single, aging monster, but on the entire rotten edifice that had protected him. They knew with chilling certainty that Croft would unleash the full force of that machine to stop them before they could expose its dark foundation to the world. The decision was made in the sterile quiet of Chloe's studio, under the stark light of the whiteboard that mapped out a 39-year-old conspiracy. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, a chorus of ghosts whispering of Julian Croft's crimes, but they knew it wasn't enough to guarantee a conviction, or even a warrant. The LAPD, once bitten by Croft's influence, would be twice shy. They needed to force an error to make the monster reveal himself. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity. Croft was scheduled to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award at the annual Visionary Artists Gala. In a room full of cameras and the industry's most powerful figures, Chloe would confront him. She would become the catalyst, using the glare of the public eye as a weapon to shatter the shadows he had hidden in for decades. It was a gamble that could get her killed, or, if it worked, finally deliver justice. Preparation for the gala was a ritual of quiet, focused dread. This was not about glamour. It was about arming for battle. Chloe selected a dress of dark, severe silk, something that felt like armor, a tribute to the fabric that started this journey. As she stared at her reflection, she saw the fatigue in her own eyes, but also a flicker of the defiant strength she imagined in her grandmother. Frank Miller arrived, his face grim, and handed her a small, state-of-the-art audio recorder disguised as a piece of jewelry. "Let him hang himself with his own words," he instructed, his voice low. The cool, dense metal of the device felt heavy in her palm, a tangible weight representing her one shot at the truth. She clipped it on, the faint click sealing her resolve. She was no longer just a journalist. She was a vessel for her grandmother's final, silent scream. The ballroom of the Beverly Hilton was a dizzying assault on the senses, a symphony of manufactured perfection. The air was thick with the scent of expensive florals and ambition, punctuated by the blinding pop of flashbulbs and the delicate clinking of champagne flutes. This was the glittering facade of the world that had devoured Ilara Vance and Isabella Monet. Across the opulent room, Chloe saw him. Julian Croft, now an elder statesman of cinema, looked regal, basking in the adoration of his peers. He was a living monument to Hollywood's power to rewrite its own history. The sight of him, so composed and celebrated, sent a wave of icy sickness through her stomach. She clutched the small clutch in her hand, the hidden recorder, a secret promise of the chaos she was about to unleash upon his carefully curated world. With a deep, steadying breath, Chloe began her slow, deliberate walk across the ballroom floor. Each step felt momentous, a march toward a destiny set in motion 4 decades ago. The crowd parted for her as if sensing the gravity of her purpose, their polite smiles and empty chatter fading into a dull roar in her ears. Her focus was entirely on Croft, a predator in his natural habitat, unaware that the hunter was now approaching. She saw his eyes scan the room, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, they met hers. There was no recognition, just the practiced, dismissive glance of a king surveying his court. But Chloe held his gaze, refusing to look away, a silent declaration of intent that seemed to momentarily disrupt the rhythm of the room. The air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken challenge. She finally stood before him, the circle of his admirers falling silent at the arrival of this intense, unknown young woman. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice impossibly calm and clear, cutting through the ambient noise. "My name is Chloe Vance." She paused, letting the surname land with the force of an indictment. "I am Alara Vance's granddaughter." A collective, soft gasp rippled through the small group. The name, a ghost from a long-forgotten Hollywood scandal, hung in the air like smoke. Julian Croft's practiced smile didn't falter, but his eyes, which a moment ago held the warmth of a beloved icon, instantly hardened into cold, flat stones. The temperature around them seemed to drop by 10 degrees. The carefully constructed performance of Julian Croft, the benevolent titan, was over. He attempted to regain control, his voice a low, condescending purr, meant to dismiss her as a deluded fan. "Alara, of course, a magnificent talent." "I was so sorry to hear she—" Chloe cut him off, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was for his ears alone. "You weren't sorry, Julian. You were relieved." She saw a flicker of shock in his eyes. "I know about Isabella Monet," she continued, her words precise and venomous. "I know Alara confronted you. I know what you did to that girl in your dark room on set." The color drained from Croft's face. His hand, holding a crystal flute of champagne, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. The mask of the charming producer was not just cracking, it was beginning to disintegrate under the weight of a name he thought was buried forever. His composure finally snapped. "You know nothing," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper that betrayed a deep, primal panic. He subtly tried to signal his security detail, but Chloe pressed her attack, refusing to let him escape. "I have Sarah Jenkins' statement. I know about the bruises. I have the financial records for Dr. Finch's bribe in the Caymans. And I have the tape, Julian. The one from her studio. The one where she tells you she's going to the police." Each piece of evidence was a nail being hammered into his coffin. He stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and pure, murderous rage. He was trapped, cornered in the one place he was meant to be untouchable. His fortress of fame and influence crumbling around him in real time. "You pathetic little ghoul," he snarled, his voice losing its cultured smoothness and dropping into a guttural growl that was his true nature. In a shocking breach of his public persona, he lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with surprising strength. "You're trying to extort me." The outburst was a fatal mistake. The commotion drew the eyes of everyone nearby. The hushed chatter of the gala died, replaced by a stunned, voyeuristic silence. Phones, which had been politely tucked away, were now emerging, their small red recording lights blinking on one by one. The scene he had worked so hard to control was now a public spectacle, and he was its unhinged, unraveling star. He had taken her bait completely. Chloe wrenched her arm free, her voice rising, no longer a whisper but a clear, ringing accusation for the entire room to hear. "I don't want your money, Mr. Croft. I want justice." She held up her own phone, the screen glowing brightly. On it was the image of Alara's star chart, overlaid perfectly on a satellite map of the Santa Monica Mountains, a red pin marking a specific, isolated ravine. "My grandmother left one final design," she announced, her voice resonating with righteous fury. "It's not a dress, it's a map. a map to Croft Canyon. A map that points to the exact spot where you buried her body 39 years ago. The specificity of the accusation, the combination of celestial poetry and cold, hard geography, was the killing blow. It was a truth too strange and too detailed to be invented. The mention of the canyon, his private dumping ground, the secret place that held his sins, completely broke him. A strangled, inhuman sound escaped his throat. Julian Croft, the legend, the visionary, was gone. In his place was a cornered animal, his eyes darting wildly, seeing enemies and accusers in every face. He shoved a nearby waiter, sending a tray of crystal glasses crashing to the marble floor with a deafening shatter that echoed the shattering of his legacy. He turned and ran, a clumsy, panicked flight toward the service exit. He was no longer a Hollywood king, but a common murderer, his guilt proclaimed not by a verdict, but by his desperate, cowardly retreat in front of the entire world he had once ruled. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The stunned silence was replaced by a cacophony of shouts, camera flashes, and the frantic murmuring of 100 simultaneous conversations. Reporters, smelling the biggest story of their careers, swarmed toward Chloe, their microphones and cameras thrust in her face. But her eyes were locked on Frank Miller, who stood near the entrance, a look of grim, profound vindication on his face. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Their impossible gamble had paid off. Julian Croft's flight was a confession, broadcast live for the entire world to see. They had not just poked the bear, they had flushed him out of his cave and into the unforgiving light. The hunt was on. The scene shifted violently, cutting to the frantic, claustrophobic interior of Croft's speeding limousine. He was a man possessed, his face contorted, in a mask of primal fear and rage as he barked orders into his phone. He wasn't running to a private jet or a safe house. He was running toward the evidence. "Get the excavator! Now!" he screamed at a subordinate. "Get the lime! Get the gasoline! We have to burn it all! Dig it up and burn it! Everything!" His panicked commands, a desperate attempt to erase the past one last time, were his final, fatal mistake. He didn't know that law enforcement, alerted by Miller the moment Chloe began her approach, had already secured a warrant to track his phone. Every self-incriminating word was being recorded, his own voice providing the final, irrefutable proof of his crimes. Chloe and Miller stood in a quiet alcove off the main ballroom, watching a live feed on Miller's phone. A single red dot, representing Croft's limousine, was speeding north on the 405 freeway, heading directly for the Santa Monica Mountains, directly for Croft Canyon. The flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers were already in pursuit, closing the net. The climax of the story was no longer the public confrontation. It was this desperate, high-stakes race to a shallow grave that had remained hidden for nearly 4 decades. Delara Vance's final message, a plea woven into silk and a map drawn in the stars, had not only identified her killer, but had now, finally, led him back to the scene of his crime. The truth was about to be unearthed. The chase ended not with a crash, but with a surrender to the inevitable. Julian Croft's limousine screeched to a halt at the gated entrance to Croft Canyon, its powerful headlights illuminating a solid wall of flashing red and blue. The LAPD had blocked the road, their tactical units moving with practiced efficiency to surround the vehicle. There was no escape. The doors opened and Croft, a shrunken, terrified figure, was pulled from the luxury of the back seat. As the cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, a detective held up a small digital recorder, playing back the panicked, damning words Croft had just screamed into his phone. "Dig it up and burn it! Everything!" In the crisp night air, under the silent gaze of the same stars his victim had used to condemn him, the producer's own voice became the final, irrefutable piece of evidence in his downfall. His empire, built on silence, had been undone by his own desperate screams. The canyon, once a private sanctuary for a predator, was instantly transformed into a sprawling, brightly lit stage for justice. The area was sealed off with miles of yellow tape, and the quiet desolation was replaced by the low hum of generators and the methodical commands of forensic investigators. Chloe and Frank Miller stood on a nearby ridge, watching the scene unfold from a distance. The cold wind whipped around them, but they barely felt it. For Miller, it was the culmination of a 39-year-old frustration, a wrong finally being righted. For Chloe, it was an almost unbearable moment of suspended reality. Down below, a team was preparing to break ground at the precise location her grandmother's celestial map had indicated. The entire weight of the past, of a family's grief and a killer's secret, was concentrated on that single patch of red clay soil, waiting to be unearthed. Hours bled into the cold dawn before the shout finally came, a sharp cry that cut through the procedural calm. "We've got something!" All activity focused on a single spot, where an investigator was on his hands and knees, carefully brushing away layers of dirt with a delicate hand. First, a piece of rotted fabric emerged, its color long since lost to the earth. Then, the unmistakable, tragic outline of a human bone. A collective, somber breath seemed to be held by the entire team. Chloe watched through binoculars, her own breath catching in her throat. A wave of nausea and profound sorrow washing over her. It was real. The ghost story had become flesh and bone. The abstract puzzle of stars and thread had led to this terrible, tangible truth, buried just a few feet beneath the surface. Her grandmother was no longer missing. She had been found. The official confirmation came within days. Dental records proved definitively that the remains belonged to Alara Vance. The forensic team made another chilling discovery alongside her. A pair of small, gold-plated scissors, tarnished but intact. They were her signature tool, a gift from a famous director, a part of her very identity as an artist. Croft had likely tossed them into the grave, as a final, cruel trophy, a symbolic burial of her talent alongside her body. The news was delivered to Liam Vance, who received it not with shock, but with a quiet, devastating acceptance. The ambiguity that had haunted him for his entire adult life had finally solidified into a brutal certainty. His mother had not left him. She had been violently torn away. The confirmation brought no relief, only a new and different kind of pain, the raw, unfiltered grief for a crime now proven. The search of Croft Canyon, expanded by the killer's own panicked orders to, quote, burn it all, yielded a second, even more horrifying secret. In a shallower, hastily dug grave just 50 yards from Alara's, investigators found another set of remains. The forensic evidence quickly identified them as Isabella Monet, the 22-year-old starlet whose death had been ruled an accidental overdose in 1985. The truth was now undeniable and complete. Alara Vance had been silenced, not just for what she knew, but for whom she was trying to save. The case was no longer about a single, cold-blooded murder, but about the predatory reign of a man who used his power to consume and discard young women, burying his secrets in the remote hills of his own private kingdom, confident they would never see the light of day. The trial of Julian Croft was a media spectacle, a public autopsy of old Hollywood's dark heart. Stripped of his tailored suits and powerful allies, Croft appeared frail and pathetic in the courtroom, a ghost of the titan he once was. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous precision. They played the muffled audio from the microcassette, Alara's furious, fearful voice filling the silent room. Sarah Jenkins took the stand, her tearful first-hand account of Croft's abuse and her sighting of him at Isabella's trailer captivating the jury. The star chart, Alara's brilliant final message, was presented as a piece of forensic evidence, a map drawn by a victim that led directly to her own grave. Chloe watched from the front row each day, not as a journalist, but as a granddaughter, bearing silent witness to the public dismantling of the man who destroyed her family. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The court clerk read the verdict with a steady, dispassionate voice. On the count of murder in the first degree of Ilara Vance, we, the jury, find the defendant, Julian Croft, guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Isabella Monet, we find the defendant, guilty. A wave of sound washed over the courtroom, gasps, sobs, the frantic clicking of reporters, keyboards. Chloe felt no surge of triumph, only the slow, heavy release of a burden she had carried for months. It was over. Justice, delayed by nearly 4 decades of corruption, fear, and silence, had finally prevailed. Julian Croft was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned to spend his remaining days in a world devoid of glamour, power, or escape. In the weeks that followed, Chloe retreated from the media storm she had created. Her podcast had become a global phenomenon, but she felt a profound need for silence. The investigation had irrevocably changed her. It had forged a deep spiritual bond with the grandmother she'd never met, a woman whose intelligence and courage had reached across time, but it had also exposed her to a depth of human depravity she hadn't known was possible. Sitting in her quiet studio, the evidence board now wiped clean, she understood that this journey was not just about solving a crime. It was about bearing the weight of a legacy, and in doing so, discovering the true measure of her own strength. The resolution of the case was also the resolution of a part of herself she didn't know was missing. The fallout from Croft's conviction rippled through the foundations of the old Hollywood establishment. His confession on the recorded phone call, combined with the evidence Chloe and Miller had uncovered, led to a series of new investigations. The former head of Croft's production company's legal department and his longtime head of security were both indicted for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, their careers ending in disgrace. The case became a landmark moment, exposing the rot that had festered for decades behind a facade of glitz and power. It served as a stark public lesson that no amount of money or influence could bury the truth forever, and that the silence of accomplices could, eventually, be broken by the persistent voice of a single, determined person seeking justice. The midnight blue gown, the catalyst for the entire saga, was finally released from the police evidence locker. It was no longer just a vintage dress or a piece of a crime scene. It was a historical artifact, a testament to a woman's final defiant act. Chloe, in a quiet ceremony, donated the gown to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art for their permanent collection on Hollywood history. The display plaque beside it told the story not just of Ilara Vance, the couturier to the stars, but of her incredible ingenuity in the face of death. The dress, once a vessel for a secret plea for help, was now a public monument to resilience, its dark silk shimmering under the museum lights as a symbol of how art and courage could ultimately triumph over violence and silence. Frank Miller found a peace that had eluded him for most of his professional life. The cold case that had stalled his career and haunted his retirement was finally, definitively closed. A few weeks after the sentencing, he drove to the newly established cemetery plot for Ilara Vance. He stood before the simple, elegant headstone for a long time, a silent conversation passing between the detective and the victim he had never been able to save. He placed a single white rose on the fresh grass, a gesture of respect and apology. Turning to leave, the weight that had settled on his shoulders in 1985 finally lifted. The ghost of the unsolved case was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a promise, however delayed, finally being kept. He could now truly rest. The Vance family was finally able to mourn. They held a memorial service for Ilara, a proper funeral 39 years after she was taken from them. Friends and family who had only known the mystery of her disappearance could now gather to celebrate the life she lived. For Liam Vance, it was a moment of excruciating pain and profound healing. He was able to stand before his mother's grave and speak to her not as a ghost, but as a person, a mother whose love had been a guiding force in his life, even in her absence. He embraced Chloe, his eyes filled with a gratitude that transcended words. The truth she had unearthed had ripped open old wounds, but it had also allowed them to finally close, healing a generational trauma and replacing a haunting myth with a story of love, loss, and incredible courage. Chloe stood alone at her grandmother's grave long after the other mourners had departed. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow on the carved letters of her name. All the questions that had launched her on this perilous journey had now been answered. He was a monster who would die in prison. The star pattern was a brilliant map that had led them to the truth. And the desperate plea to help me had, at long last, been heard and answered. Chloe reached out and traced the name on the cool stone, feeling a final, powerful connection. Elara Vance's legacy was not just in the beautiful gowns she created, but in the unyielding strength she had demonstrated in her final moments. And Chloe knew with absolute certainty that her own life's work would be to continue that legacy, to fight for the silenced, to uncover the buried, and to ensure that no cry for help, no matter how faint, ever went unheard again. The silence in Chloe's studio was different now. For months, it had been a canvas for her theories, a space filled with the frantic energy of the hunt. Now it was a space of quiet contemplation. The whiteboard, once a chaotic web of names, dates, and conspiracies, was stark white, wiped clean. The case was closed. But the story of Elara Vance was not over. It had simply transformed. It was no longer a haunting family myth, or a cold case file gathering dust. It had become a testament to the enduring power of a single voice, a story of a woman who, facing an unspeakable evil, used her final moments not to surrender, but to design the very map that would lead to her own justice. Her legacy was no longer defined by her disappearance, but by the brilliance of her escape from silence. The fall of Julian Croft was more than just the conviction of one powerful man. It was a seismic tremor that shook the very foundations of old Hollywood. His trial laid bare the rotten infrastructure of complicity that had enabled his predatory reign for decades, a system of corrupt lawyers, bought-off officials, and a culture of fear that demanded silence. The case became a landmark, a public reckoning that forced an entire industry to confront the ghosts it had tried so hard to bury. It was a stark reminder that influence has an expiration date, and that power, no matter how absolute it may seem, cannot build a fortress strong enough to contain a truth that is determined to be free. The story of Elara and Isabella became a catalyst, empowering other voices to come forward, turning a single investigation into a movement. Among the evidence cataloged from the shallow grave in Croft Canyon, the most poignant were the gold-plated scissors. To Croft, they were likely a trophy, a final, cruel insult to the woman whose talent he was extinguishing. But he had fundamentally misunderstood their power. Those scissors were not just a tool. They were a symbol of Elara's creativity, her precision, and her voice. And in the end, it was that voice he could not silence. Her true final masterpiece was not a gown of silk, but a puzzle of thread and stars, a design so intricate and resilient that it outlived his empire of lies. The scissors, now resting in an evidence box, were a testament to his failure. He could bury the artist, but he could never, ever bury her art. This journey was a powerful lesson in the nature of truth itself. In a world saturated with digital noise and fleeting information, the answers were not found in a data cloud, but in the tangible, physical world. They were discovered in the delicate texture of a thread, the faint graphite lines of a sketch, the microscopic particles of red clay clinging to a hem, and the warped magnetic hiss of a forgotten cassette tape. It served as a profound reminder that history has weight and leaves fingerprints. The past is not an abstract concept. It is etched into the objects we leave behind, waiting for someone to look closer, to listen to the silent stories they have been holding for years, patiently waiting for a voice to give them life. The successful resolution of Elara's case gave 2 women their voices back, but it also opened a door to a much larger, more unsettling question. How many other stories like theirs remain untold, their truths locked away in dusty evidence boxes, whispered in hushed, fearful conversations, or encoded in the fabric of ordinary objects? The end of this one chapter was just the beginning of a much larger mission. And if you want to be part of what comes next, to join the search for other buried truths, make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications. Because the fight for justice never really ends. It just moves on to the next silenced voice waiting to be heard. For Chloe, the investigation was a crucible that forged a new identity, She began her journey as a journalist, a professional narrator who kept a safe, sterile distance from the tragedies she chronicled. But this story had dissolved that barrier. She was no longer just telling the story. She had become a part of it, a central character in her own family's long-delayed final act. The pursuit of truth had demanded more than just her skills as an investigator. It had demanded her courage, her vulnerability, and her heart. In finding her grandmother, she had also found a part of herself she never knew was missing, discovering a purpose that was infinitely more profound than any story she could ever just report. The Vance family legacy was reborn from the ashes of a 39-year-old crime. The ambiguity and sorrow that had haunted Liam Vance for his entire life were replaced by a story of incredible strength. He could now speak of his mother not with the pained uncertainty of a man searching for a ghost, but with the pride of a son whose mother was a hero. The narrative was no longer about a tragic victim who vanished. It was about a brilliant strategist who fought back, a loving mother who left a final, indelible mark on the world. The story of Alara Vance was finally hers again, reclaimed from the monster who had tried to erase it and rewritten in the language of courage, intelligence, and unwavering love. Ultimately, this was a war between silence and a voice. Julian Croft had built an empire on his ability to command silence, to use his immense power to intimidate, corrupt, and erase anyone who threatened him. His entire world was a fortress constructed of fear and secrets, but he underestimated the simple, profound power of a single voice that refused to be extinguished. In her final desperate hours, Alara Vance used the tools of her own trade, a needle, a thread, a pen, and her knowledge of the stars, to craft a message that was louder and more enduring than any threat. She proved that even the faintest whisper of truth, if given enough time, can grow into a roar that shatters decades of silence. The midnight blue gown now rests behind protective glass at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, its silk shimmering under the soft gallery lights. It is no longer a piece of evidence, but a work of art, a symbol of defiance. The story of the star pattern serves as an eternal reminder that even in the most profound darkness, a single point of light can illuminate a path to justice. It proves that a simple thread can be stronger than a tyrant's fortress, and that a message of hope can travel across generations to find its way home. And it leaves us with one final, lingering question. How many other secrets are woven into the fabric of the world around us, just waiting for someone to look close enough to read them?